Hi, in this video, I'd just like to talk a little more in depth about when to use self and when to use super. And in order to understand that, let's first review how or when it's possible to call a base classes overridden method. So let's consider these two methods, the Dunder Init method override as well as the Dunder string uh, method override in the teacher and the person class. So are there any differences here? Well, especially to those Java, C++ programmer among you, then these two overrides they look a little different, right? Because for the Dunder Init method, the nil or the Dunder Init method in the derived class has an additional parameter. Like so in C++ or Java lingo, it's like these two methods actually have different signatures because they differ in the number of parameters. However, for the Dunder string method, the signature for the number of parameters did not change. So um, it might look different that way, although the difference in practice does not matter in Python. So in the derived class, in this case, the teacher class, we are defining a Dunder string method which overrides the base class person classes Dunder string method. So inside this class, the only way to call the base classes method that we are overriding right now is by using the super parentheses dot syntax. Okay, this is the only way to call that. And so what if we try to call, self dot the string? Well, if you do that, then because we are defining the Dunder string method, self dot Dunder string would be calling itself. So it will be an infinite recursive call. So you cannot do that. So super is kind of the only way to call the method, the base classes method that we're overriding. Okay. Okay. What about in the case of the Dunder Init? Now Dunder Init, the new Dunder Init we're defining in the derived class has a slightly different quote unquote signature, right? It has an actual parameter. So is it possible then, if we don't specify that that extra parameter, is it possible that we are calling the base classes than the init method? And we already saw this, right? If we take this thing out, basically it doesn't let us do that. And the reason for that, we've already talked about this before, that in Python, and this is unique to Python, which is different from C++ or Java, that a name can only be associated with one object. In this case, the object is the method, right? So a name Dunder Init for the teacher class can only be associated with one method, and that is the kind of the latest definition for Dunder Init, which is this, which requires that it has a salary parameter. So just as a summary, so what we just talked about is first, a method name can only associated with one method for any given class. So Dunder Init, it's only one method, even though there might be a Dunder Init in the base class, right? So then from the second point is from within the class, if we actually want to override, if we want to call an overridden method in the base class, we can do so by using super dot and then the name of the overridden class overridden method in the base class. Okay, and then the third point is that if we're outside the class, there's really no way to call an overridden method in the base class because because we would be calling the method in the derived class, because that is the last definition for method definition for that particular name, right? Okay, so this is about methods that have been overridden. Now, what about methods that have not been overridden? Should we call self or should we call super? Now, this is one example that I come up with. Um, so let's say in the person class, there is a method called initial. And what it does is it takes the first character from the first name and concatenate it with the first character in the last name, right? And in the derived class, the teacher class, I'll have a method called sign with the initial, and all it is doing is it's not really doing any signing. It's just printing out a message saying, you know, I'm signing with this particular initial, and to get the initial, I call the supers initial, right, which was the method that we wrote up here. So here is, I say teacher dot sign with the initial, and if we run this, it's all good. Teacher Z Yang, the initial would be Z and Y, right? And so here it says signing with initial ZY. So this is kind of what we expect. So that works. However, the question is, should we have used super here to call the base classes method? So let's try another example, and that is, what if at a later time we decided that for a teacher, teacher's initial should be a little different from a normal person's initial. So we are going to override then the initial method, and the difference is, instead of capitalizing the initial, teachers like to have lower cases for the initial for some reason. So it would use the super, the base classes initial, okay, but it would do lowercase. So obviously, having done this, we would like the teacher to sign with the new lowercase initial, right? However, do you think it will do that? Well, it doesn't. Right? The teacher is still signing with the original all caps initial, and that is the reason for that is that in the sign with initial, we kind of hard coded so that it would always call the base classes initial method, despite the fact that it was not originally overwritten. We later override it, right, with our new definition. Okay. So, okay, hopefully that makes sense. And that's what this slide is trying to say, and also this one. So, kind of another summary is that to call a base classes methods, you should actually generally use self dot and then that method's name, unless, of course, as we saw earlier, that we're calling the base classes method from inside the derived classes overridden method of the same name, right? So like in the case of, calling the base classes Dunder Init from the derived classes Dunder Init. Okay, so in that case, then we have to use super to kind of avoid the infinite recursion that we saw earlier. Okay, so well, okay, now it's having listened to all of that, you I would like you to do something very similar experiment with the student class, that maybe the student class can override the initial method so that it does something a little different, right? Say, for example, it would repeat the initials once. So for someone Jack Ryan, the initial would be JR and then JR, right? And in the student class, define its own kind of sign with the initial method, and then make sure you correctly call the initial method from within the sign with the initial method. So pause the video, give that a try. And assuming you've done that, I just like to conclude this video with just a couple words regarding the Dunder Init method and Dunder String method, and when you should call the base classes equivalent of these methods. So the general rule of thumb is that for Dunder Init, you should probably always call super Dunder Init. Right, and that is so that the base classes Dunder Init has a chance to initialize everything that it needs, right? Because the instance of the derived class must be an instance of the base class, right? So pretty much you would always want to do that. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this, if you don't do that in the derived class, PyCharm is not happy with you. It would actually tell you that call to the Dunder Init of the superclass is missing. So do heed the warning of PyCharm. And then for Dunder string, then yes, we usually call the super Dunder string to get a description of the instance of the base class, and then we append whatever extra information that the derived class has to the string returned by super parentheses excuse me dot Dunder string method. And then for other methods, when you may or may not want to call the base class methods, depending on what the requirement for those methods are.